So the Talented Tenth, this elite group of African-American artists, as I was saying, they tended not to want popular forms to enter their art. Jazz they considered a folk form and didn't take it seriously. So you had a tendency to keep the status quo bourgeois topics. And what W.E.B. DuBois called the Debauched Tenth were artists who, on the contrary, wanted to shock and let modernist themes, not just modernist forms, but modernist themes, such as sexuality and the body, and taboo subjects in general, like prostitution. They wanted these topics and modernity as a whole, and reality, you could say, as a whole, to be part of their writing. So you had a group of artists like Langston Hughes, who was mostly a poet, but also a dramatist, and he did write some prose, and Zora Neale Hurston, who, as I said, is famous for Their Eyes Were Watching God, this amazing novel. They formed a kind of a loose group of artists who collaborated to some extent, not for very long. Mostly Hughes and Hurston. They collaborated on a play and a number of other works, but it didn't last very long, as I say. Even their newspaper, called Fire, right, Fire with 2 exclamation marks after it, only lasted for a single number, a single issue. So now they call themselves, at least Zora Neale Hurston called that group the Niggerati. Now it sounds like a bit of a shocking term, and it did shock some people, on both African Americans and white people, but she used this term in a slightly self-mocking way, but also in a self-glorifying way, since she said that, well, you have the literati downtown, so we must be the niggerati. And so it's a way of using this taboo slang term and emptying it of any negative connotation. Right, you see that in films as well, contemporary films where African Americans use that terms of each other or of white Americans. Right, so it's a way of bandying the term so that it serves your own purpose. Right, so it's a kind of humorous. It was a way of letting humor enter culture, and a certain amount of self-derision, but also a way of using language to empower yourself, and not let language make you feel less human. So they called the rooming house that they stayed in on 136th Street in New York, Niggerati Manor. So in Niggerati Manor you had artists like Zora Neale Hurston, who stayed there for a while, Langston Hughes, Wallace, Thurman. So as I say, they published a magazine called Fire, and the first short story in that magazine was called Cordelia the Crude, and it was by Wallace Thurman. So even just the title, Cordelia in English literature is usually associated with King Lear. She's King Lear's daughter, and she symbolizes purity, virtue, absolute, almost, absolute perfection. She was seen by Victorians as a kind of ideal daughter. And so here you have just the title Cordelia the Crude, suggesting all sorts of scurrilous things going on there. And the story is about a 16-year-old African-American girl who has to turn to prostitution, but it's described in, you know, what others would consider immoral ways. So she's not exactly chaste in any way. And you had another story also that was included, you know, to shock. And this story talks about homoerotic situations in a very explicit way, which is, you know, quite revolutionary for the period. You know, so the Harlem Renaissance could actually be called the Harlem Revolution, because it was really more of a cultural revolution than a rebirth. As such, it was more of just a first birth rather than a rebirth. To go back to those dates so that they're clear in your mind. So 1917 is usually chosen as the natal year. Now in 1917 you had the birth of the first African American magazine, The Messenger, and you also had a desegregated magazine, you know, owned by white patrons, called The Seven Arts, and they published an African-American poet for the first time. They published 3 of Claude McKay's poems, and so this, you know, was a radical departure from other you know, other segregated practices. And the third phenomenon that occurred in 1917 was that for the first time you had 3 plays by an African-American with an all African-American cast set in Broadway. And so this was, you know, a sudden flowering. Of course, there were writers before 1917. I mean, W.E.B DuBois started publishing in the early 20th century. In 1903, his famous collection of essays was published then. And you had other poets before that, like Dunbar, like Paul Dunbar. But for the most part, their work petered out a while before the Renaissance, and they were just isolated artists. You know, the first African-American poets even emerged in the 17th century with Jupiter Hammond, for example, and Phyllis Wheatley. But as I say, they were very isolated artists. In the Harlem Renaissance, you have this sudden coming together of lots and lots of talented artists in every one of the arts. You had a filmmaker, well, the first major African-American filmmaker called Oscar Micheaux, and he was mostly centered in Chicago, but you know, the films were shown in Harlem as well, and contributed to cultural life in Harlem. So he talked about such taboo subjects as miscegenation, mixed race relationships and marriages, and also rape. So, you know, his second film, Within Our Gates, talks about this white man who is about to rape a mixed race African American, and just as he's about to, he sees a birthmark on just around here on her skin, and finds out that she's actually his daughter. Right, so you have this this rather shocking subject matter, very, you know, and he was banned in certain theaters, but he really forwarded, he really furthered the, well, African cultural agendas in America. In the arts, you have, well, many sculptors and artists and painters. I'm thinking of Aaron Douglas, most particularly. He's probably one of the most emblematic. So here's a painting called Aspiration. So you see his use of cubism here. It's a bit like the Delaunay, you know, like Robert and Sonia Delaunay, their brand of cubism. You know, you can feel a certain influence there, but it's still very much his own work. So this cubist geometrical, you know, it's light cubism, so that you know, it's very representational, since his agenda is rather political. So here you, as you can see in the lower part of the picture, you have African American slaves yearning to be free. So that's the past, and in the top parts of the picture you have this new intelligentsia, this new, well, intellectual elite, creating scientific advances in society. You also see it here in this picture. And so you have a tendency to show African Americans in positions of power, in positions of making science advance, right? So a real demonstration of intellectual parity. And there are other painters. Here's another painter called W.H. Johnson. And this is a street scene in Harlem. So here we have more of an expressionist, but also cubist influence. I mean, painting didn't really break away from European models, European 20th century movements, until abstract expressionism came along. You know, with Jackson Pollock, that was the first really American, you know, truly American painting movement that emerged directly in America. So another painting is called American Justice, another kind of iconic painting called American Justice here by Joe Jones. And here you have well, a depiction of a lynching in the American South. You see the Ku Klux Klan, and they've just lynched an African American woman. You see her house burning in the background, and well, the defeated dog there, a symbol of fidelity and truth. And it's, you know, it's a rather telling, a rather ironic, it's got a very ironic title, but well, I have a little quibble with it, is that it's a beautiful painting, but it tends to soften or to sweeten something that's something atrocious. What I mean by sweeten is that, well, you know, the Ku Klux Klan members, you know, almost look like Smurfs. They, you know, and the reality of this kind of lynching was much harsher than that. You had, you know, people strung up hanged in public places, sometimes burnt, mutilated in you know, unspeakable ways. And so, you know, white people even sent postcards of these lynchings to each other, of African Americans burnt to a crisp. And you know, you can see on the postcards, you know, white Americans smiling and having good fun around these lynchings, as if they're kind of, you know, great entertainment. So that's my problem with this painting, is that it just it's not realistic enough. So you have an aesthetic problem there, I think, you know. But it's still a good painting, and its title is pretty mordant as well. Okay, so now I'll come back to this and speak to you later about you know, novels in this period. And also, I'll probably do another video on poetry, because it really was a heyday of poetry. So that's one of its strongest points was poetry. You have here a picture of Nancy Cunard. This was from an exhibition in Paris a few years ago, and so she's one of Zora Neale Hurston's Negrotarians, in that her mother was a terrible racist, and so partly in revolt against her mother, and partly because she was fascinated by African American culture, she reboosted the Harlem Renaissance with a Negro anthology of poetry, published in 1931. So in the Great Depression, she did sort of regenerate flagging energies. You can see here that well, this photograph really shows her passion for all things African American. You can see her ivory bracelets here. She practically has the value of 2 tusks on each arm. So these African ivory bracelets symbolize her engagement with African American voting rights, and you know, she really promoted their culture, as did other Negrotarians. Here's one famous, Carl van Vechten, and well, the title of this novel is misleading, as I'll explain later in the next video. But this was published in 1926, and it was a great hit. But some African Americans didn't like the title at all, understandably. And so, well, County Cullen, for instance, stopped talking to him for 14 years, even though they were very close friends. So yeah, white American interaction with African American writers was, for the most part, very happy. But there was some tension occasionally. There was a tendency for some patrons, some white patrons, to not deliberately condescend, but to essentialize African Americans. So, you know, there were art patrons who felt that African Americans were more in tune with their emotions. So they tended to essentialize them in that way, as, you know, being close, sometimes seen as closer to nature, closer to emotion, which is something that W.E.B. DuBois would have shied away from. So this kind of essentializing also went on to some extent within the African American community. There was, of course, a tendency to valorize lighter skin within the community. Some, like in Oscar Micheaux's films, the richer African Americans are seen to have light skin, and the poor characters always have darker skin, right? So that's a tendency that went on until the 1960s at least, where you had brown paper bag parties, where, you know, at the entrance to parties they would hold up a brown paper bag to your face, and if you were darker than the brown paper bag, it was a light beige color, then you couldn't get in, right? So that went on until the 1960s within the community itself. So a kind of internal racism. But generally speaking, in both the Talented Tenth and the Debauched Tenth wanted to promote African American experience and to revalorize the color black. And so you have a desire, like Gladys Hayford, she said that you should, you know, put an end to this feeling of shame that African Americans had, and to present African American experience as something glorious, right? As a glorious adventure is the expression she used. So I'll just finish up on a definition of W.E.B DuBois, and he defined what he called double consciousness as this feeling that the African American community had, according to him, of feeling divided, feeling slightly alienated because of what Theodore Roosevelt later called, well, at the same period roughly, called hyphenated identity. And he said that, so both these, well, Theodore Roosevelt felt that there was no room for hyphenated identity, that you should be only American and nothing else. Whereas Du Bois argued that inevitably, inescapably, African Americans felt that they had a kind of double consciousness. And I'll just read his definition of that to make it clearer. He says, and this is in The Souls of Black Folk, a group of essays he published in 1903. He said, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Right, so, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back with more on the novel in the Harlem Renaissance and then poetry in the Harlem Renaissance. Thanks for watching. Bye.